You think you know the story of the Wild Swans, the tender fairy tale where a devoted princess saves her brothers from a cruel enchantment. You might recall the image of white birds gliding over moonlit lakes, or the silence of a sister weaving nettles with bleeding hands. Yet what if I told you that this gentle tale hides something far older, darker, and more unsettling than the versions whispered to children at bedtime? Beneath the surface of the beloved narrative lies a current of myth and ritual that echoes across millennia. Archaeologists, historians, and folklorists have uncovered clues that suggest the story of the 11 Swan brothers and their silent sister is not merely a moral parable about love and endurance. Instead, it may descend from sacred rites of transformation, trials of silence, and sacrificial bonds that once shaped ancient civilizations. The Wild Swans may be a fragment of forgotten memory carved into myth, waiting to be decoded. Once upon a time, there was a young princess named Elisa. She lived with her 11 brothers in a grand kingdom, under the protection of a father who was king. Their mother, gentle and kind, had passed away, leaving them vulnerable. The king remarried, taking as his new queen a woman whose heart was steeped in cruelty and envy. The stepmother despised the children. To rid herself of the boys, she used enchantments drawn from her dark arts. One day, when the princess was still young, the queen transformed each of Elisa's 11 brothers into swans. At sunrise they were birds, white-winged and untamed, yet at nightfall they regained their human forms. Elisa herself was sent away, hidden from her brothers and left to wander. When she grew older, Elisa sought to find her brothers. She traveled through wild forests and distant lands, finally meeting them in their swan forms by the shore. They revealed the truth of their plight. Only by enduring great suffering could she break the spell. She must weave 11 shirts out of nettles gathered by hand from graveyards and marshes. Each nettle cut her skin and filled her palms with wounds. Worse still, she had to perform this task in absolute silence. If she spoke even a single word before her work was finished, her brothers would perish. So Elisa labored in silence, bearing her suffering with courage. She worked while others accused her of witchcraft, and even when she was condemned to death, she did not cry out. At the last moment, as flames rose around her, she cast the final shirts upon her brothers. The enchantment broke, and the 11 swans became men once more. Only one bore a wing instead of an arm, for the shirt had not been completed. Yet they were saved, and Elisa was vindicated. In the end, the siblings were united, and peace was restored to their lives. But the tale of the Wild Swans was not always told in this form. Its most familiar version was shaped by Hans Christian Andersen, who published it in 1838. Andersen's telling emphasized Christian patience, silent endurance, and a triumph that comes through suffering and faith. Elisa became a paragon of virtue, embodying the ideal of the self-sacrificing woman. Yet when we trace the story further back, we find variations across Europe and beyond. In Celtic traditions, tales of siblings transformed into swans were told centuries earlier. The Irish legend of the children of Lear, for example, speaks of 4 children turned into swans by a jealous stepmother, cursed to wander in bird form for hundreds of years. Their tale ends not with deliverance, but with sorrowful death after the coming of Christianity. Here, the swan is less a symbol of triumph than of tragedy and exile. In Germanic folklore, we find stories of brothers or sisters bound by enchantments that can only be undone by silence and toil. Some early versions do not feature nettles but other impossible labors. The emphasis shifts depending on the era. In medieval retellings, silence symbolized the cloistered devotion of monastic life. During the Romantic age of the 19th century, silence became a metaphor for misunderstood genius or feminine suffering. Even Andersen's version was not untouched by cultural influence. His emphasis on Elisa's silence mirrored ideals of womanhood in his society, where female virtue was tied to patience, humility, and endurance of pain. The story was reshaped by centuries of changing values, layered like archaeological strata. Each layer altered the moral tone: tragedy in Ireland, endurance in Germany, Christian sanctity in Denmark. Thus, The Wild Swans is not a static tale but a living organism, adapting to each society that retold it. What appears to be a single story is, in truth, many stories, echoing across time, reshaped by the fears and desires of different cultures. If we dig deeper, the story of Elisa and her 11 swan brothers reveals striking connections to ancient myths that predate Andersen or Celtic bards. The motif of human to-bird transformation appears in mythologies across the globe. In Greek myth, Zeus himself often took the form of a swan, and Leda's fateful encounter with him produced children destined to shape the Trojan saga. Here the swan was not merely an animal but a divine messenger, a liminal being between mortal and immortal realms. In Norse tradition, Valkyries were sometimes described as swan maidens, donning feathered cloaks to move between worlds. When stripped of these cloaks, they became bound to mortal men. The swan's white feathers symbolized purity, but also entrapment, the fragile boundary between freedom and captivity. From India comes another echo, the Hamsa, a mythical swan that represented the soul's ability to cross between earthly existence and divine truth. Associated with Brahma and Saraswati, the Hamsa was revered as a guide between realms, much like Elisa guiding her brothers from cursed existence into human restoration. Even the princess's task of weaving nettles carries symbolic resonance. In ancient rites, weaving was often tied to fate and destiny. As with the Greek Moirai or the Norse Norns, to weave from nettles plants associated with pain, purification, and death was to embody suffering as a sacred act. Elisa becomes less a sister and more a priestess, conducting a ritual of transformation through her own wounds. Silence, too, has deep mythological roots. In Egyptian tradition, Harpocrates, the god of silence, represented hidden knowledge and the power of unspoken words. To remain silent while performing a sacred duty was to protect cosmic balance. Elisa's silence thus becomes a ritual vow, binding her work not just to her brothers but to an ancient cosmology of word and power. When seen in this light, Elisa is not simply a devoted sister, she becomes a symbolic priestess, a liminal figure bridging the mortal and the divine. Her brothers, as swans, embody the soul's imprisonment, and her ritual of weaving is the act of cosmic restoration. The Wild Swans is not only a fairy tale, it is a fragment of myth, refracted through the centuries, still carrying the resonance of forgotten rites. In 1911, during excavations in County Galway, Ireland, archaeologists uncovered a carved stone fragment depicting 11 waterfowl in flight, with a central female figure holding what seemed to be a bundle of reeds or plants. Scholars debated whether it was purely decorative, but many now believe it illustrates a proto-version of the swan children motif. The artifact, carbon dated to nearly 1,500 years ago, suggests that stories of human-bird transformation were not merely oral tales but woven into the sacred iconography of Celtic communities. Other discoveries expand this trail. In 1963, at a burial mound in Schleswig-Holstein, Germany, archaeologists unearthed a fragment of textile that appeared to depict swan wings, embroidered alongside female figures engaged in weaving. The association between swans and female ritual labor suggests an older symbolic layer, where swans were guardians of transition and weaving was a form of sacred duty. The motif appears even beyond Europe. Folklorists examining Siberian shamanic traditions noted rituals in which feathers or cloaks enabled shamans to journey in swan form between the worlds of the living and the dead. Meanwhile, in Central Asia, myths of bird brides and bird brothers preserved the theme of transformation as a spiritual journey. What astonishes scholars is the near-identical pattern: siblings or kin cursed into avian form, and a remaining family member who must undergo suffering to restore them. This structure appears in Ireland, Germany, Russia, and even distant India. Experts argued that the tale may have originated not in the 19th century, nor in the Middle Ages, but in prehistory, perhaps in Indo-European mythological frameworks over 4,000 years old. Thus, The Wild Swans ceases to be a quaint moral tale. It emerges as an artifact of humanity's collective memory, a surviving shard of ritual and myth encoded in story. Its endurance across cultures speaks to something universal: the fear of exile, the hope of redemption, and the conviction that suffering willingly embraced has power to heal. What appears on the surface as a fairy tale of enchantment may, under symbolic decoding, reveal a ritual map of the human soul. The nettles Elisa gathers are no ordinary plants. Nettles sting, wound, and bleed the flesh. In many ancient traditions, such plants of pain were used in purification rituals, driving out weakness and forging resilience. To weave shirts from nettles is to transform pain into protection, crafting garments of redemption from wounds themselves. Each shirt embodies the alchemy of suffering turned into salvation. The silence imposed upon Elisa is equally profound. Words, in ancient belief, were not mere communication but carriers of magical power. To refrain from speaking while undertaking a sacred duty is to prevent leakage of spiritual energy. Her silence is not weakness but an oath, a vow that amplifies the potency of her sacrifice. The brothers, transformed into swans, symbolize more than loss. The swan itself embodies liminality, the state of being between. It glides between sky and water, earth and air. In this, the swan mirrors the human soul's movement between mortality and transcendence. The brother's condition is not merely a punishment but a symbolic imprisonment of the soul within transient, fragile existence. Even the incomplete shirt that leaves one brother with a wing in place of an arm reveals symbolic depth. It suggests that restoration is never perfect, that scars of transformation remain. Healing through sacrifice brings salvation, but it also leaves marks that testify to struggle. The brother with a wing instead of an arm is not a flaw in the story but a symbol of the cost of redemption. Thus, Elisa's labor can be read as ritual priesthood. She is not only a sister but an archetype of the healer, the mediator, the one who bleeds so that others may be restored. Through her, The Wild Swans ceases to be a tale of childhood and becomes a mythic instruction manual for endurance, sacrifice, and spiritual transformation. The story of the Wild Swans you once believed was only a children's tale now reveals itself as something far older and stranger. Beneath the surface of Elisa's sacrifice lies the convergence of myth, archaeology, and spiritual tradition. The silent weaving of nettles recalls rites of pain and purification known across cultures. The Swan brothers echo Indo-European and global myths of transformation and exile. The incomplete restoration hints at the eternal truth that healing always carries scars. Far from being a fragile fairy tale, The Wild Swans is a survival of myth. It is a journey between worlds, where siblings move between human and avian forms, and where a sister acts as priestess, healer, and redeemer. Her silence is a vow, her wounds are offerings, and her triumph is not merely personal but cosmic. When we place this tale alongside archaeological evidence, stone carvings, textile fragments, and global parallels, we see not a local legend but a shard of humanity's shared spiritual memory. It is as though the swan wings themselves have carried the story across centuries, across oceans, whispering through cultures that never knew one another yet dreamed the same dream of transformation and redemption. So when next you hear of the Wild Swans, remember, you are not hearing a bedtime story. You are hearing the echo of ancient rituals, of a mythology that once bound communities to the cycles of suffering and rebirth. You are hearing the memory of a sister who became priestess, a healer who bore wounds for others, and a myth that still spreads its white wings across the human soul.